This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news recorded just after midnight GMT on Monday, the 8th of September. I'm Frederick Dove with highlights from across BBC World Service News today. And coming up, President Obama explains why his country needs to confront the Islamic State militants.
If allowed to control significant amounts of territory, to amass more resources, more arms, that over time that can be a serious threat to the homeland.
Later in this podcast, the sound of a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine.
Mortars being fired around Donetsk airport, the fighting resuming in breach of the ceasefire.
Also, the mysterious disappearance of flight MH370. 6 months on, we'll hear from the family of one of the missing Chinese passengers. Spotting an asteroid the size of a bus, we hear how difficult that can be. And also of note in this podcast, the jazz musician, impressing audiences not because he's blind, but because he's so young. But first, when a US president gives an interview teeing up a speech he'll be giving in a few days, he clearly wants to emphasize the importance of that speech to the public and to him. After taking flak for saying that he didn't have a strategy to deal with the Sunni militants of Islamic State, Barack Obama says he will present one on Wednesday. Here's a taste of it, as revealed to NBC TV.
Over the course of months, we are going to be able to not just blunt the momentum of ISIL, we are going to systematically degrade their capabilities, we're going to shrink the territory that they control, and ultimately we're going to defeat them.
Mr. Obama said he wanted to explain the threat posed by the militant group formerly known as ISIS or ISIL.
More than anything, I just want the American people to understand the nature of the threat and how we're going to deal with it, and to have confidence that we'll be able to deal with it. We have not seen any immediate intelligence about threats to the homeland from ISIL. That's not what this is about. What it's about is an organization that, if allowed to control significant amounts of territory, to amass more resources, more arms, to attract more foreign fighters, including from areas like Europe, who have visas and then can travel to the United States unimpeded, that over time that can be a serious threat to the homeland.
Mr. Obama's strategy is dependent on the Iraqi government finding some stability and on Sunni Arab nations in the region stepping up, as he put it. And we'll hear what the Arab League had to say in just a minute. But first to Iraq and our correspondent there, Jim Muir. The Americans are already in action in Iraq. How much difference, Oliver Conway asked Jim, will this make then?
Well, I think it is going to make a difference over the next few days. They have, in a sense, slightly jumped the gun in bombing or carrying out airstrikes near Haditha, because that's a Sunni area. They'd always said they wouldn't get involved, basically backing up the Iraqi army in the field with the air power until there was a proper, broad-based, representative and inclusive government in Baghdad that brought the Sunnis fully on board, so that the idea would be to wean the Sunni population away from the militants, isolate the radicals and strike them that way. Now, we understand that the movement in Baghdad is towards the announcement of a government on Monday. Many things can go wrong at the last minute, but the deadline is in fact Wednesday. So by the time Mr. Obama makes his speech in Washington, there should be an inclusive, or at least on paper, an inclusive government in place in Baghdad. And that would then be used by the Americans as their kind of launching pad or their platform for a move against the IS in all the areas where they are, which is virtually all the Sunni parts of the country. It's a risky enterprise. It could go badly wrong. The Sunni component in the new government will be fragile. If a lot of Sunnis start getting killed by American bombs or by a Shiite-dominated Iraqi army, they could face very severe problems.
Now, the Americans are saying they're not going to have boots on the ground. Is the Iraqi army up to this?
The Iraqi army, this is a very big question because, for example, the town of Amerli, which, as you'll remember, had its blockade by IS broken by an American-backed move on the ground, which essentially involved Shia militias, implying that the Iraqi army is really not in very good shape to carry out offensives. So that doesn't augur terribly well. And if we're going to see Shia militias going into war against Sunni areas backed by the Americans, that is not a happy combination, and it could, as I say, go very badly wrong. The Iraqi army needs to be restructured and completely remodeled after its collapse in Mosul, and you can't do that overnight. It's going to take months, if not years, to do that. It's had billions spent on it. It went to pieces. Putting it together is not a quick and easy job.
Jim Muir in Iraq. Well, the Arab League has also been meeting. What message will they be sending? A question James Kumarasamy put to our Middle East editor, Sebastian Usher.
They're sending a stronger message than the one they've already been sending. I mean, there's been an awful lot of, and this is partly what President Obama was trying to answer in his long interview today, this sense that the Arab countries haven't stepped up to the plate on this, that this is their problem in their region, and they to some extent have helped create it. So what are they going to do about it? Now, the Arab League met today, the foreign ministers in Cairo. They issued a strong statement. The Arab League is very good at issuing strong statements. It doesn't mean that very much will happen, saying that they will cooperate with everything that is going to be done to counter ISIS.
And the US Secretary of State John Kerry is heading to the region on Tuesday. What is he hoping to get beyond these statements of support?
Well, what he will be hoping is that there will be some kind of new government in place in Iraq. This, again, is the first thing that President Obama said in his interview, the first step that has to be taken, because it was thanks to US pressure, thanks to pressure from some of the Arab states, thanks to Iranian pressure with all the influence it has in Iraq, that the deeply unpopular previous prime minister, who was seen as having exacerbated all the tension in Iraq, was removed, Nouri al-Maliki, and has been replaced by another politician who's seen as a much more conciliatory figure. He has until the 10th of September, until Wednesday, to have a government in place. On Monday, it's meant to be there. Parliament is meeting a session. The hope is that it will be representative, that the different groups will join, the Sunni groups will join. That's still a big question. So Mr. Kerry will hope that that has actually gone somewhere and achieved something, and he can move on from that.
Sebastian Usher. Now, elsewhere in his NBC interview on Sunday, President Obama said that the United States may be able to use its military assets to help combat the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. The virus is now thought to have killed more than 2,000 people across Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone and Nigeria. It's also spread to Senegal. Our West Africa correspondent is Thomas Fessi.
Is the US getting closer to sending military incident response teams to West Africa? President Barack Obama suggested just that in an interview with NBC News.
We're going to have to get U.S. military assets just to set up, for example, isolation units and equipment there to provide security for public health workers surging from around the world. If we do that, then it's still going to be months before this problem is controllable in Africa, but it shouldn't reach our shores.
The leading medical charity, Médecins Sans Frontières, has repeatedly said that aid workers and the World Health Organization alone wouldn't be able to stop the spread of the Ebola virus. MSF said wealthy states only could make a difference on the ground. President Obama didn't give any more details or time frame for a potential deployment, but there is no doubt that it would be welcomed with relief if such a plan came to pass.
Thomas Fessi reporting from Dakar in Senegal. The ceasefire in eastern Ukraine appears to be holding just, but there's not a great deal of confidence about how long that may last. Late on Saturday, shelling resumed in the coastal city of Mariupol, and on Sunday, local officials said one woman had been killed and 3 people injured. There's also been more fighting around the airport north of Donetsk, the city which is a stronghold of pro-Russian separatists. Also in Donetsk, the BBC's Richard Galpin.
Mortars being fired around Donetsk airport this morning. The fighting resuming in breach of the ceasefire, which has only been in force for 2 days. Both sides appear to be firing at each other. The Ukrainian troops trying to keep control of the airport from rebels who seem determined to seize it for themselves. The mortars sparked fires in a nearby village, burning down several houses. Anastasia Ivanosenko said they were just coming back to their home to pick up a pushchair and warm clothes for their baby when they discovered the house was on fire. There was nothing we could do, she says. We just watched. Other villagers expressed deep cynicism about the ceasefire, believing it'll never work. But international observers monitoring the ceasefire here are less pessimistic. Kai Wittrup from the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe says it's too soon to declare the ceasefire has failed.
I don't think this will jeopardise the ceasefire. It shouldn't.
So you think the ceasefire can still remain intact despite what's happening here and also down in Mariupol?
As long as both parts want it, yes, of course.
The next few days will be critical. If the fighting remains sporadic, then there's still a chance the ceasefire could work.
Richard Galpin in Donetsk. This is Global News, the best stories, interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. To comment on any of the topics covered in this podcast, email us, globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk, or post a message online at facebook.com/BBC World Service. Now to Afghanistan, where the rape and robbery of several women who were returning from a wedding party last month has provoked public anger and calls for the men found guilty to be executed.
We want the perpetrators to be punished in whatever way that they deserve and what is the demand of people.
Here in Afghanistan, it is Islamic society, and if a woman committed this kind of crime, then she would be stoned. So what we want, without any further delay of their cases, they should be sentenced and there should be their public execution.
The men found guilty are expected to appeal, but if those appeals are rejected, says President Karzai, then he will sign the decree authorising the men's execution. David Loyne sent this report from Kabul.
Even in a country weary of reports of violence, the rape of a group of women, one of them pregnant on their way back from a wedding, has led to widespread revulsion. In Paghman, to the west of Kabul, where the attack took place, protesters carried banners painted with a single word, Idam, hang them, in the local language Dari. The women were stopped at night by a group of men wearing police uniforms. They were robbed and raped at gunpoint within the hearing of the men of their families. 7 men were arrested in Ghazni to the south. The Kabul police released photos showing women in burqas identifying their assailants. When the men came to court in a one-day trial, the judge revealed that one of them had previously been jailed for rape. All 7 were sentenced to death by hanging. There are believed to be some 400 prisoners in Afghan jails who've been sentenced to death, but President Karzai has been reluctant to sign the final warrants authorising hanging. In this case, faced by a major public campaign, he said that he will sign the death warrants once the appeals process has been completed.
And that was David Loyne in Kabul. 6 months ago today, a Malaysian airliner went missing on a scheduled flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. Despite a massive international search operation, the plane has still not been found. Its disappearance remains a mystery. Around 2/3 of the passengers on board were Chinese, and in China, our correspondent Martin Patience has travelled to Hubei province to speak to the family of one of the missing passengers.
We're a 3-hour drive from Beijing in a small village in Hebei province. Now, this is a farming community, and there aren't actually a great deal of opportunities for young men here. So many of them seek work overseas. They work in construction sites across Asia. And in front of me is actually a recruitment office offering that exact type of work. Now, 6 months ago, 8 migrant workers from this area were returning home on flight MH370. And their families are still waiting for them. Biang Lan Chin is among the missing. At their shared farmhouse, his parents, brother, wife and 2-year-old son are all washing their hands before eating lunch. Mr. Biang was working on a construction site in Singapore, saving up to open a dental practice back home. His wife, Ling Li, is kept busy by their boisterous toddler. But even the joy that little Hao Hao brings cannot mask her pain.
My life is a mess. I'm very sad when I look at my son. He's so little. When I see him calling other people daddy, he just wants his daddy.
And what have you been doing in the last 6 months to try and cope?
It's so hard for me. When I see his picture, it breaks my heart. I hope they will find the plane soon. It's too hard to bear. My son misses him, and I do too.
And what do you tell your son?
I tell him Daddy will be back soon, that he just went out to earn money.
Thousands of miles away, the search for the missing airliner continues off the coast of Australia. Despite using highly specialised equipment, the operation has discovered no trace of MH370. Most of those on board were Chinese, and the one thing that unites the families of the missing is that they all want answers. Galvanised by grief, Mr. Bian's brother, Liang Wei, has travelled to Beijing to take part in protests. And he says that on one trip, he was briefly detained by the authorities.
The
government has not helped in any way. They want us to settle with the compensation we received and stay at home and wait. But we want more information about the plane.
He says his family has been devastated by the incident.
I can't bear to look at my nephew. When I look at him, I see my brother's eyes. My parents are not in good health. This is such a big disaster for our family, but we are still waiting. We still have some hope that he is still alive.
In the garden, little Hao Hao drives around in a small electric car. Despite all the agony in the family, he seems to be a happy little boy. His mother's determined to give him as normal an upbringing as she can. She still hopes for a miracle, that she won't have to tell Hao Hao his father isn't coming home.
That report from China by Martin Patience. We can all, it seems, breathe a sigh of relief because the Earth, I am pleased to report, is safe. Now, why might it not have been? Well, it seems an asteroid measuring 20 metres across has just missed our planet. At the closest point, when it was over New Zealand, it was about a tenth of the distance that the Moon is from the Earth generally. Unlike the meteor which exploded over Chelyabinsk in Russia last year, this time there was no damage. But there are worries about what could be done if an asteroid just a few metres across was to hit us, and also about how difficult these space objects are to detect. The asteroid that's just passed us, 2014 RC, was first spotted just a week ago, and James Kumrasamy has been speaking to Eric Christensen, director of the Catalina Sky Survey at the University of Arizona, who discovered it while peering up into the skies.
2014 RC was discovered in the course of normal survey operations from one of our telescopes in the Catalina Mountains outside of Tucson. We typically scan the sky every clear night outside of the full moon period, and during a normal night of surveying, we turned up this object along with a couple of other objects, but this is the one that has caught everybody's attention because of its close pass.
Yeah, and that's pretty unusual.
An object of this size passing so close to the Earth is a little bit unusual, but remember that this is a small asteroid, and one about this size might pass within the distance of the Moon on a sort of a monthly basis.
And you only saw it last week. Would you expect that, or would it be possible to find it, to pick it out a bit earlier than that?
An asteroid this small are really only visible to our telescopes when they're very close to the Earth, so we tend to pick them up when they are passing fairly nearby. Larger asteroids can be spotted farther out, and their close passes can be predicted further in advance.
Now, potentially, how much damage could a 20-metre wide asteroid actually do?
Well, we have a pretty good example in our recent history. The Chelyabinsk impactor was about 20 meters in diameter. So the good news is our Earth's atmosphere does a very good job of protecting us from small asteroid impacts, but you might expect to see a large airburst, maybe a shock wave, possibly some large meteorites that would hit the ground. But remember that only about 3% of the planet is populated, so most of these impacts happen in unpopulated areas.
Eric Christensen of the University of Arizona. Now, how old do you have to be to play a bit of jazz, or indeed to impress a knowledgeable crowd of jazz lovers? The answer is not very old at all. As Susana Mendonça reports, at an international jazz festival in Bolivia, one young performer has attracted a lot of attention.
Yes, that was a child's voice you just heard there introducing this track. The jazz man behind the piano is actually a jazz boy. José André Montaño is 9 years old. He formed a band when he was 5 and started playing at just 3. But what's age got to do with it?
Brasil, también a Lima, Perú.
I've already been to Brazil and to Lima, and I've also been playing in other places, such as La Paz, Santa Cruz, Cochabamba. I'm already famous because I travel a lot.
And the Bolivian child prodigy, who's also blind, has been attracting plenty of attention from around the globe. Johnny Enright leads the London-based Latin jazz band Grupo X.
I think he's an exceptionally talented musician. What stands out for me the most is even though he's very mature, there's still a childlike sense of fun about his playing and a real passion for the music.
José André has been demonstrating those skills at Bolivia's International Jazz Festival. Vero Perez is a jazz singer who's worked with him.
The most interesting thing about José André is that he plays in such a way that he shows other musicians how jazz music really is, which is to be completely free and improvise and to play with the musicians you're with. You might be playing one note and then he'll change it. You really have to be ready to play with him in this serious game that is jazz.
A game that this little 9-year-old can play a lot better than musicians 3 times his age.
That report by Susana Mendonça. And that's all from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available for you to download later on Monday. I'm Frederick Dove, and until next time, goodbye.